Notice the indigenous people, gently brushing the ears of wheat in the unhurried breeze. They could never have imagined that in the centuries to follow, this very earth that nourished them would descend into an unending nightmare. It is completely okay to simply observe this. They had no way of knowing that upon this soil soaked in their blood, a colossal empire would be born. One that would dictate the laws of the generations to come. Now, let your body settle completely. Surrender your exhausted mind to the dark, silent currents of history. You might discover, as you follow our cinematic lens, how this behemoth called America was forged in a crucible of iron and blood. Our journey begins by anchoring softly in the distant past. We return to that blood-red dawn across the vast ocean. Let your awareness drift to early 15th century Europe. Notice how a restless energy began to permeate the air. It was the scent of burgeoning trade, the greedy, unbiding breath of newborn capitalism. The narrow, confined local markets could no longer satisfy the bottomless hunger of expansion. And yet, the overland Silk Road to the east felt like a constricted throat, gripped tightly by the massive, formidable Ottoman Empire. Just notice this tension. Let it be. In this space of awareness, see how the art of shipbuilding and the compass from the ancient East fell like two cold, heavy keys into the hands of European powers. Gazing out at the turbulent Atlantic, a fanatic fire flickered in their eyes. If the land route was blocked, they would simply cleave through the ocean waves. They sought a maritime Silk Road leading to Eastern wealth. The age of discovery roared into existence, accompanied by the howling wind tearing through heavy canvas sails. Just breathe with that sound. Let your senses feel the year 1000. For 192nd, the air is thick, heavy with the dampness of sea salt. Christopher Columbus, backed by the heavy gold of the Spanish crown, set sail across the deep ocean. He carried letters meant for Indian monarchs and Chinese emperors. But notice how the compass of destiny played a cruel joke. His fleet did not arrive at that golden eastern realm. Through a blind stroke of fate, they violently pushed open the gates of the American continent. Embrace the impermanence of his destination. This mistake, this deviation from the path, instantly shocked Spain, and indeed the entirety of Europe. In the eyes of these powers, this untouched, uncharted land was an undefended feast. Western European nations, like a pack of starving wolves, immediately launched massive invasions and frantic expansions into the Americas. Spain, riding this bloody tide of plunder, rapidly swelled into the world's first empire on which the sun never sets. Allow the mental noise of this conquest to simply pass through your mind. The storm of civilization is always painted with the deep, resonant shadows of tragic sacrifice. For the indigenous Indians of the American continent, the footprints of the Europeans were the very shadows of death. They were forced to fall into the abyss of colonial rule and suffering, collapsing in pools of blood from endless slaughter. After discovering the Americas, the system of colonial slavery established by Columbus himself in Latin America branded this land with the deepest scar of disaster. Sit with this heavy truth, finding your sanctuary within. It is exactly as revealed by the cold, restrained strokes of Marx's capital. Uncovering a cruel truth, the discovery of gold and silver in America. The ruthless extermination of native peoples, their enslavement, and their living burial deep within dimly lit mines. The conquest and reckless pillaging of the East Indies. Africa brutally transformed into a commercial hunting ground for black lives. All of this shocking accumulation of flesh and blood was merely the blood-red dawn of the capitalist era of production. Notice the recursive loop of history. Breathing in, breathing out. Once the scent of blood disperses, all predators awaken to the wind. Facing this new continent, European powers arrived in throngs, sinking into the frantic excitement of carving up the territory. In 1607, the British Empire established its first permanent colony in Jamestown, Virginia, and by the 1662s, to escape the suffocating religious oppression of the Old World, some British people began a perilous, unknown migration, dragging their families toward this new land. Let time drift forward to 1620th. Notice the howling wind, tearing at the gray, despondent sea. Freezing rain whips against the wooden deck like a harsh lash. A solitary ship named the Mayflower struggles toward Virginia, but observe how an unpredictable, violent storm completely shreds their intended course. After a long, desperate tossing, this vessel is forced to dock in a desolate wasteland over 500 miles from its destination. Surrender to this loss of control. In this piercing, biting cold wind, these refugees faced a fatal crisis of law. They had slipped beyond the jurisdiction of the English king. They had no legal right to remain permanently on this earth. Merely to survive, to gain the legitimacy that would grant them a foothold. These wanderers gathered, see them huddled on the narrow deck of the Mayflower, smelling of mold and the pungent sea. After intense deliberation, jointly signed a covenant of self-governance. This document, born on the rocking, storm-battered floorboards, would be honored by later generations as the Mayflower Compact. And so, the American story that would dominate the centuries to come drew back its heavy curtains, witnessed only by wilderness and ocean waves. This brief, simple covenant not only established the logic of grassroots autonomy, but became the very birth certificate of the future empire. Find your equanimity here. In the quiet origin of a storm. In the nearly 100 years that followed, populations from the European continent began pouring into the Americas like a burst dam. This unstoppable flood expanded the map of North American colonies all the way to 13. Yet you might ask, could this fragile contract, signed hastily on a wooden deck, truly lock away the swelling ambitions of an empire? The British sovereign state across the deep water watched coldly as this colony's wings grew full. When a massively expensive war was about to hollow out the British treasury, a batch of Eastern tea, exuding a bitter, dark aroma, was about to completely ignite the powder keg in this newborn world. Let the racing thoughts settle as we observe the spark. As time gently drifts forward, we cast our gaze toward the North American ports of the mid-18th century. Before 1760, a seemingly harmonious and prosperous trade agreement was maintained between the British mainland and the colonies. A massive maritime transport network, like a complex web of veins, carried endless wealth and resources across the ocean back to the British Isles. However, the operation of that colossal imperial machine required the endless burning of gold coins. Between 1756 and 1763, the British Empire and France were dragged into the 7 Years' War, deeply exhausting the national treasury. As the smoke of war cleared, it left behind a bottomless fiscal black hole for the British Crown. To offset these massive financial losses, the lofty British Parliament made an arrogant choice to ruthlessly raise taxes on the colonies. Notice how this brutal extraction, like a drop of ice water falling into boiling oil, instantly provoked fierce anger and deep dissatisfaction among the colonial people. Just watch the ripples of this anger from a place of stillness. The fuse of conflict was finally detonated in Boston Harbor, heavy with the bitter scent of tea leaves. In 1773, to save the deeply indebted East India Company, the British Parliament forcefully granted them a monopoly to dump massive amounts of tea into North America. The rage of the people could no longer be contained. This violent energy manifested as the history-shaking Boston Tea Party. Tons of tea were poured into the freezing Atlantic. Notice the dark red tea water foaming murky on the sea surface, exuding the raw, metallic scent of rebellion. This highly provocative riot completely tore away the remaining dignity between the mother country and the colony, intensifying their conflict. As punishment, in 1774, the British Empire threw down the oppressive coercive acts. Using heavily armored ships and cannons, they shut down Boston Harbor. They forcefully deployed fully armed garrisons and ruthlessly commandeered civilian homes. Observe how these suffocating, high-handed maneuvers brutally stripped away the freedom of the people of Boston, directly severing their very means of survival. Allow yourself to witness this without judgment. At this moment, the illusion of compromise completely shattered. The people of the 13 colonies finally realized that only by uniting, by walking the bloody path of violent resistance, could they carve out a path to survival on this continent. On September 5, 1774, representatives gathered in Philadelphia, their faces solemn and drawn. They convened the First Continental Congress. See the flickering candlelight dancing lazily in the hidden chamber, casting deep, resonant shadows as they began to discuss the earth-shattering conspiracy of armed rebellion and independence. Half a year later, on the early morning of April 18, 1775, in Lexington, Massachusetts, the thick fog had yet to lift. Accompanied by the accidental firing of a single flintlock musket, the Lexington militia fired the first shot against the British Empire. Following this, several small-scale battles erupted one after another. Though small in scale, they were like the ominous cracking of a glacier about to fracture. They declared that a life-and-death armed struggle was completely inevitable. Let your mind rest in this inevitability. On July 4, 1776, in the heavy, sweltering summer heat of Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress convened. They solemnly passed the world-renowned Declaration of Independence. With cold, resolute words, they officially declared the 13 colonies completely separated from British colonial rule. They chose to forge a nation through force, assembling a regular military and entrusting the fate of the entire army to Commander-in-Chief Washington. From here, the brutal slaughterhouse of the Revolutionary War fully opened its doors. Between 1776 and 1781, the muddy battlefields of the North American continent were intertwined with artillery fire and severed limbs. Both sides fought as they negotiated. Ultimately, with the intervention and support of France, the arrogant main force of the British Army crumbled into dust on American soil. In September 1783, as the ink settled on the Treaty of Paris, the British Empire was forced to bow its head, acknowledging American independence. This 8-year carnage of flesh and blood brought a final, tragic victory. Breathe into this space of awareness, letting the ghosts of the past settle. Yet you might discover that shattering the old world is merely the prologue. Forging a new machine of state is the true test of an empire's foundation. In 1787, again in Philadelphia, verbal swords clashed behind the closed doors of the Constitutional Convention. Here, they passed the Constitution of the United States. The nation shed its fragile, loose outer shell, transforming into a true republic. This cold, unyielding constitution precisely established the iron principles of popular sovereignty, separation of powers, and republicanism, like heavy metal gears embedded into the chassis of the empire. He laid the most solid institutional foundation for the future prosperity and power of America. Notice how subtly the fracturing of power planted its seeds at the very beginning. At the convention around the issue of the federal system, the political realm had already fractured into Federalists and anti-Federalists. By 1789, when the first federal government was formed, the Federalists held the power tightly, and by 1791, the anti-Federalists gradually evolved into the Democratic Republican Party, fueled by state-level Democratic forces. This dark, surging undercurrent of power play further split after 1824 into the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, the latter inheriting the political tradition of the Federalists. The endless, iconic two-party struggle of American history had already taken its initial form in that 1787 Philadelphia room. Allow the monkey mind of politics to gently fade away. In 1789, the first Congress announced that this written constitution, the very first for an independent, unified nation, officially took effect. In the same year, Washington, having forged an extraordinary reputation in the fires of the Revolutionary War, was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. During his term, like a cold, precise architect, he built the federal cabinet, issued judicial regulations, and established the Supreme Court, thoroughly solidifying the federal republican system. This leader, known as the father of the nation, calmly handed over the highest power to Adams in March 1797. Ending his 8-year term, he left behind the political precedent of a 2-term limit for the presidency. A young republic seemed to have donned an indestructible armor of institutions. But notice, when the ink of the Constitution dried, when the transfer of power was complete, the greed hidden deep within this vast land was left unsatisfied. To the north, the bayonets of the British Empire stood ready for a comeback. To the south lay snow-white cotton, stained with the blood of enslaved black people in the plantations. To the west stretched the endless wilderness, where generations of Indians had breathed and lived. As the state machine began to roar, the next slaughter, the next internal tearing of brothers in arms, was already sharpening its blades in the shadows. It's completely okay if this feels heavy. Just breathe through it. Having barely established its foundation, the giant wheel of the empire irreversibly steered toward frantic expansion. If the first war was the battle of foundation, then the second drawing of the sword was the complete exposure of the empire's instinctive expansion. Ever since American independence, the unwilling shadow of the British Empire had never dissipated. They deployed heavy troops in the Canadian colonies, always ready to return. Frictions in maritime trade sizzled like a lit powder keg. In 1812, taking advantage of the raging fires of war in Europe, when Britain had no time to look west, America decisively marched north, intending to annex Canada. The blood-red curtain of the War of 1812 was violently drawn open. But observe how the iron hammer of reality ruthlessly smashed this wild dream of expansion. The war did not go as smoothly as America envisioned. By August 1814, an enraged British army struck directly at the heart. Iron hooves cruelly crushed the streets of Washington. President Madison fled frantically under the cover of night. The British Army launched a mad retaliation in Washington, setting a massive fire to the White House and the Capitol. Amidst the sharp crackling of bursting wood, The flames illuminated the night sky like the end of days. This young republic almost vanished into ashes in the raging inferno. Find stillness in the ash. Just as the empire seemed ready to collapse, a turning point arrived on the southern defense line. In December 1814, Andrew Jackson stepped forward. He led troops in a stunning defensive battle in New Orleans. With the bloody cost of heavily crippling the British Army, he reversed America's decline. Both sides eventually signed an armistice in Ghent at the end of 1814. Notice how this evenly matched meat grinder of a war, though granting neither side an advantage nor altering the poor map, used mountains of white bones to further pound into reality America's independent status. Since the path north was blocked, the flood of capital unhesitatingly turned its direction. Like a starving beast, it lunged toward the boundless, untamed wilderness of the West, surrender to the flow of this history. In 1830, Jackson, now sitting on the presidential throne, coldly signed the Indian Removal Act. The state machine officially roared to life. A massive migration known as the westward movement mutated into an apocalyptic disaster for the native Indians. The bayonets and horse hooves of the army turned against the original stewards of this land, unleashing systematic, massive expulsion and slaughter. America used the most barbaric means to seize vast, incredibly fertile lands. They forcefully cleared a path for a boundless domestic market, propelling the economy to leap forward while stepping upon mounds of white bone. Let yourself see that every page of America's rise is thoroughly soaked in the tragic blood and tears of the Indian people. Anchor yourself as you witness this pain. Stepping on the corpses of the natives and accumulating massive capital, America's appetite grew increasingly ravenous. By 1846, to further annex territory, the guns of America aimed once more, this time at Mexico to the south. In May 1846, the Mexican-American War erupted. This naked war of aggression lasted for nearly 2 years. In January 1848, a powerless Mexico was forced to sit at the negotiating table. Humiliated, they ceded vast territories, including the state of California. Notice how perfectly the gears of destiny locked together in this moment. In that very year of 1848, in California, and once considered barren, inside a backward little fishing village named San Francisco, a worker accidentally caught a piercing gleam of gold reflecting from the mud of a riverbed. Massive gold resources were uncovered. Countless prospectors with bloodshot eyes, their minds filled with wild fantasies of instant wealth, surged in like a relentless tide. San Francisco rapidly swelled into a world-renowned city. In just 20 short years, California's population exploded. Wealth soared exponentially. San Francisco leapt to become America's most cosmopolitan city of desire. Breathe out the heat of this frenzy. But notice, gold did not bring peace. Instead, it was the lethal poison tearing the empire apart from within. Wealthy prize of California instantly triggered the fatal, long-hidden contradictions within the United States. For over 70 years since its founding, two starkly different economies had grown grotesquely upon this earth. In the north lay the roaring capitalist industry, in the south, the cruel plantation system of slavery. The industrial capitalists of the north required a free labor force to run the machines and complete their capitalist expansion. The plantation owners of the south poured all their funds into buying more slaves. They relied on ultimate physical extortion and ruthless exploitation to frantically hoard wealth. By 1830, the population of enslaved black people in the southern states had surpassed 1 million. Under the crack of the leather whip, Day after unbidden day, they picked cotton. Notice how every pure white cotton boll is soaked through with the blood and despair of the enslaved. Hold space for this profound grief. These irreconcilable economic systems eventually pushed the nation into the abyss of division. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln, a Republican advocating the abolition of slavery, was elected as the 16th president. Lincoln's unyielding stance to abolish slavery upon taking office directly forced the Southern slave owners into rebellion. In 1861, the artillery fire at Fort Sumter officially drew the bloody curtain of the American Civil War. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln laid down the deciding move of the Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation was officially issued unimplemented, granting enslaved black people the legal identity of free citizens. Observe how this weightless piece of paper transformed into the sharpest of weapons. Massive numbers of angry black brethren joined the northern camp, completely inverting the power balance of the war. There were for full years of brothers turning weapons upon each other, with 1,000,000 corpses filling the ravines. Ultimately, the northern capital achieved complete victory. The empire was spared from the doom of division. Let the exhausted mind rest amidst the quiet after the battle. Let us drift to April 1865. To Ford's Theater in Washington. Driven by extremists' deep-seated hatred of Lincoln's policies, this great president who led America out of the quagmire of slavery was brutally assassinated in the deep, resonant shadows of his private box. Lincoln fell. The Civil War concluded. The map of the Union was preserved. But notice, the game of power was far from over. To rebuild the ruling order in this devastated, scarred nation, the capital giants of the North and the remaining old forces of the South were about to conduct a deeply chilling political transaction beneath the negotiating table. Whose flesh and blood would pay the price for this deal? History did not pause at the sound of the assassin's gunshot. It merely slipped away into a more hidden, secret abyss of profit. Breathe in the shadows. In 1865, the rumbling cannons of the Civil War finally ceased. The empire barely pieced together its undivided map using 1,000,000 corpses. Yet, the smoke of the battlefield had just dissipated when the cruel division of spoils opened its curtains in the arena of power. At first, American politics maintained a landscape dominated solely by the Republican Party. But with the fierce rise of the Democratic Party, this state machine, stretched tight by two equally matched factions, fell into a suffocating political deadlock. To prevent the nation from sliding back into the abyss of civil war, and to achieve a so-called unified reconstruction, both parties knew they must reach an unseen collaboration beneath the table. And so in 1877, an utterly chilling political transaction took shape. The Democrats pinched their noses and recognized the legitimacy of the Republican president. In exchange, the Republicans coldly tossed the noble promise of racial equality into the fire like a piece of scrap paper. They immediately withdrew all federal troops from the South, stopped all propaganda regarding racial equality, and thoroughly severed all aid to the Southern Black Rights Movement. Witness this impermanence of justice. This cold, paper compromise indeed guided America back toward a unity, seemingly free of internal conflict. But it formed the most naked betrayal of the black community. The achievements of equal rights, bought with countless drops of blood, were mercilessly erased. The path to black equality, burdened and long, plummeted once again into a drawn-out, endless night. As the internal cracks were forcibly stitched shut, America's inherently violent gaze began to sweep greedily outward. And the first to fall as sacrifices were the Chinese laborers, paving the very foundations beneath the empire's iron rails. As early as the mid-19th century, the news of California's gold drifted across the ocean, attracting countless Chinese to join the gold rush just to survive. In 1868, America even signed the Burlingame Treaty with the Qing government, hypocritically promising to respect free immigration. In the 1860s, the Transcontinental Pacific Railway was a symbol of industrial miracle, and its most treacherous, perilous sections were almost entirely built by the rough hands and cheap, bloody sweat of Chinese workers. Just acknowledge their silent labor. However, notice what happens when the empire's economy sinks into a cycle of depression. The Chinese laborers, enduring extreme hardship while demanding so little, instantly became the targets for the bottom-tier American public to vent their frustrations. They were accused of stealing the livelihoods of white men. Even more fatal was the cutthroat partisan warfare between the two parties fighting desperately for votes. The Chinese, possessing absolutely no political voice, were reduced to the perfect political sacrifice. 1882, accompanied by the wet ink of President Arthur's signature, the Chinese Exclusion Act crashed down like a heavy, dark iron pot. This act brutally prohibited Chinese laborers from entering, and even the entry of non-laboring Chinese faced harsh, unforgiving restrictions. By 1888, the clauses of the act were further and maliciously expanded. This was the first severe exclusionary act in American history targeting a specific race. It openly, legally established discrimination against the Chinese community, leading to countless Chinese in America suffering horrifying massacres and persecution. Not until World War II, when China and America became anti-fascist allies, did President Roosevelt, acting purely on strategic calculations, finally repeal it. Let the space of awareness hold this injustice. Stepping over the white bones of the lower classes, America at the end of the 19th century saw its overall economic might become like a giant beast gored on fresh blood, swelling rapidly unto the absolute top of the world. Notice that the appetite of capital is infinite. It sought new sources of raw materials, new markets for goods, and places to dump surplus capital in order to extract the absolute highest monopoly profits. This empire, already profoundly addicted to profit, began an even more frantic overseas expansion. The map of the world at that time had been thoroughly carved up by old colonial empires. But America astutely sniffed out the scent of a dying carcass. The declining Spanish Empire became the first prey for this sharp, new predator. In 1894, America bared its fangs at Spain, and the Spanish-American War erupted. America positioned Cuba right at its doorstep as its primary target to devour. Spain had conducted extremely cruel exploitation and oppression of the Cuban people during its colonial rule, sparking the Cuban uprising against Spain. The bloody suppression by the Spanish military perfectly provided America with an ample moral excuse to intervene in the posture of a savior. Simply observe this machinery at work. In April 1898, the fires of war were ignited simultaneously in Cuba, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia. This overwhelming, asymmetric strike lasted a mere 4 months, and the decaying Spanish Empire was thoroughly rooted. On December 10, 1898, both sides signed a humiliating treaty in Paris. Spain was not only forced to abandon Cuba and recognize its independence, but it also ceded Guam and Puerto Rico to America, and for the paltry price of $20 million, sold the sovereignty of the Philippine Islands cheaply, like a mere piece of cargo. Through this bloody feast, America announced to the entire Western world its absolute power, stepping into the ranks of top-tier nations and acquiring overseas colonies for the first time. As Theodore Roosevelt came to power, America walked entirely onto the path of no return of overseas colonial imperialist expansion. Internally, he struck hard against monopoly giants. Externally, he frantically pushed the Monroe Doctrine, forcing the entire American continent under the strict control of the United States. At the same time, heavily expanding the naval fleet, he aggressively pushed the open-door policy in Asia, single-handedly pushing America onto the iron-blooded throne of the world police. Let the ego of the empire fade into the background. Yet, accompanied by warships patrolling the four oceans, was the complete loss of control of domestic capital giants. In 1907, due to long-term, bottomless blind faith in the freedom of financial markets, the American financial sector, lacking unified regulation, erupted into an extremely severe crisis. Massive amounts of social funds were stuffed by trust institutions and banks into the wildly fluctuating stock market, ultimately triggering a devastating tide of bank runs. A vast number of enterprises and banks declared bankruptcy amidst screams of despair. This disaster made the American elite realize they must put a harness on the wild horse of capital. In 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich united with the Morgan Financial Group and the president of the National City Bank, alongside other top financial giants. In a hidden, dimly lit room, they concocted the Aldrich Plan, aimed at establishing a central bank. This blueprint nominally established a government central bank, but in essence, it had every functional sector tightly contracted to private banking giants. It was state-owned in name, but entirely private in reality. Just breathe and observe the illusion. Although, because the greed was too visible, it faced public boycott and obstruction from various states. These financial oligarchs possessed immense patience. They waited until 1912, when Wilson was elected president, and arranged for his people to revise the original plan. He increased the voice of the federal government, ultimately packaging it as the Federal Reserve Act. On December 23, 1913, after experiencing numerous twists and turns, the Federal Reserve was officially established. The bankers achieved an overwhelming historical victory. This act not only standardized the American financial market but, in the centuries to follow, morphed into an invisible, giant hand, tightly gripping the throat of the global economic landscape. By now, the armored ships, cannons, and financial scythes of America were completely forged and tempered. And at this moment, across the Atlantic, the old European powers were drawing their swords over the uneven division of spoils. The countdown of 1914 had already begun. This world's largest, most greedy nouveau rich lay silently in the resonant shadows, ready to lick clean a global meat grinder that would swallow tens of millions of living souls. Surrender to the silent horror of this moment. As the clouds abruptly shifted on the world stage, America welcomed its perfect moment to harvest the globe. From the late 19th to the early 20th century, accompanied by the steel roar of the Second Industrial Revolution and the birth of monopoly oligarchs, the major capitalist powers irreversibly stepped into the stage of imperialism. In this slaughterhouse where the strong feast on the weak, due to the extreme imbalance of capitalist economic and political development, those bloodshot-eyed imperialist nations, fighting for world hegemony in colonies long since carved up, finally tore off their last disguise of civilization. In July 1914, The meat grinder of the First World War roared into motion on the European continent. While the young men of Britain, France, and Germany died in droves, turning into severed limbs in the mud of the Somme Firden, America, across the Atlantic, sat coldly on the bleachers of a neutral nation. Like a greedy god of death, it watched the world burn from a safe distance while frantically reselling munitions, making a massive fortune from the war and earning until its pockets overflowed. Not only that, America took advantage of the chaos while European powers could not look elsewhere, unscrupulously taking over the vast overseas colonial assets of the old empires. Notice the heavy weight of this accumulation. Yet, the ultimate goal of this beast was never merely to sip the broth. In 1915, the sinking of the Lusitania caused US-German relations to sharply deteriorate, providing the perfect opening for America to descend into the fray. The American elite were extremely clever-headed. If they wanted to divide the greatest spoils after the war, they had to step down onto the field themselves, forcefully snatching the initiative away from Europe. And so in 1917, America raised the hypocritical banner of maintaining world peace, officially joining the Allied powers and bearing its bayonets at the Central Powers. Early in 1918, while the embers of World War I still burned, an impatient America attempted to use a single presidential document to redraw the post-war world order. President Wilson highly publicized the so-called 14 Points Peace Plan, attempting to use this chance to recarve the old colonies of Europe to solidly seat himself on the throne of the world's true leader. But the old empires were clearly unwilling to surrender their scepters. Signed in June 1919, Britain and France, like chasing away a scavenging hyena, coldly tossed Wilson's peace plan to the side. America's first attempt to lay its hands on world hegemony was thus declared a failure. Allow the grand illusions of power to dissipate. But so what? The arrogant European powers failed to realize that. By this time, America's total industrial output had terrifyingly surpassed the combined sum of Britain and Germany. Its economic might had leapt to number one in the world. After World War I, America, rapidly swelling by gnawing on the corpses of Europe, transformed instantly into the world's largest nouveau riche. In the brief period of peace, high-speed prosperity even birthed famous cultural empires like Disney and Time magazine. However, the carnival of capital always reaches its end. In 1929, an unprecedented great economic crisis, like a freezing black hole, instantly swallowed the entirety of America. The Great Depression swept the nation. The streets were filled with bankrupt souls wandering aimlessly. The icy air was mixed with the scent of cheap alcohol and the sweat of despair. The submachine guns of gangsters sprayed across the streets. Corruption and starvation shrouded this once arrogant land. Until 1933, when Franklin D. Roosevelt, sitting in his wheelchair, took command in the face of disaster. With an extremely tough, iron-fisted approach, he implemented the New Deal, forcefully dragging the shocked imperial economy back from the brink of death. Experience this recursive loop of collapse and rebirth. Just as America was licking its wounds, the toxic tumor of war across the ocean burst open once again. In 1931, Japan engineered the Mukden incident. In September 1939, German forces blitzed Poland. The Second World War completely erupted. Facing this catastrophe of humanity, America once again brought out its incredibly rehearsed script for making money. Pursuing isolationism, it watched the flames from across the ocean. In the early stages of the war, America did not immediately join the fight. Instead, it frantically conducted blood-soaked business with warring nations across the globe. Even after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, America never stopped its blood transfusion of resources to Japanese fascism. From the end of 1931 to mid-1937, America coldly exported to Japan up to 90% of its scrap iron, 90% of its copper, and 45% of its lead. Even more chilling, inside the roaring warm machine of the Japanese invading army, over 60% of the oil came from American pumping wells. Amidst the dull, heavy blasts of the freighter horns, America raked in unimaginable wealth. Notice how every green dollar bill dripped with the blood of innocent Asian civilians. Sit with the discomfort of this truth. Not until 1941, when Japan's frantic expansion in Southeast Asia finally touched the bottom line of America's own core interests, did America suddenly turn its face, completely freezing trade with Japan. In the same year, to acquire prime overseas assets and military base leasing rights from its allies. Roosevelt's administration pushed through the Lend-Lease Act. In December 1941, Japan launched a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. The roaring flames and thick smoke of explosions completely shattered America's illusion of staying out of the fray. It was forced to declare war on Japan, pulled into the ultimate meat grinder of World War II. Once the empire's war machine runs at full speed, its destructive power is enough to make the gods tremble. The Manhattan Project, lasting 3 years and gathering over 1,000 top scientists, secretly stated the ultimate seed of destruction deep within the barren desert. By August 1945, two terrifying weapons named atomic bombs erupted with temperatures of thousands of degrees and massive shockwaves in the skies above Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Notice how these two cities instantly transformed into a living hell. Faced with absolute annihilation, Japan declared unconditional surrender. Surrender your exhausted mind to the deafening silence. The Second World War finally drew its curtains amidst these earth-shattering nuclear blasts. Looking back at these two world wars that nearly destroyed human civilization, notice how the flames of war never touched the American mainland. This continent, protected by the vast ocean, not only made immense fortunes from war but allowed the world's top scientific talents and massive wealth to pour in like 100 rivers returning to the sea. When the smoke cleared, the old colonial empires led by Britain and France had been drained of their last drop of blood. Stumbling and staggering, they exited the center of the historical stage. America, this once untamed wilderness, finally relying on a military force that crushed everything in its path and gold reserves that rivaled nations, sat securely in the #1 seat of the world. It is intensely cold at the summit, when there were no longer any old world powers in sight. Another giant red bear, forged equally in the fires of war, had already cast a massive, suffocating shadow at the far edge of the Eurasian continent. And it was exactly in this world, completely shattered by war, that America finally cast out its ultimate network to rule the earth. Let the shadows stretch out before you. In the late stages of WWII, as the anti-fascist alliance repeatedly crippled Japan on the battlefield and the Soviet army stood firm on the Western Front, the victory of the war was already in sight. In this moment, when the old world was completely broken, the establishment of a new post-war economic order was swiftly placed on the agenda. On July 1, 1944, representatives of 44 nations, carrying their own hidden calculations, gathered in America, jointly signing agreements on denouncing the birth of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. This post-war monetary order, known as the Bretton Woods system, was in essence the establishment of an international hegemonic network with the US dollar at its absolute center. Under this system, the dollar was directly pegged to gold, and the currencies of all member nations had to maintain a fixed exchange rate with the dollar. By this time, America had not only won the war but had completed an unprecedented frantic harvest in the economic realm. According to statistics, as WWII neared its end, America had astonishingly dominated over 75% of the total official gold reserves of all countries in the world. Almost the entire gold of humanity, through the cruel machinery of war, flowed into the vaults of America-like rivers finding the sea. Backed by this mountain of gold, piece after piece of dark green paper printed with the heads of presidents established an unshakable hegemonic status, although, due to the extreme imbalance of capitalist development, the inherent flaws of the dollar were increasingly exposed, ultimately leading to 1973, when nations passed the Jamaica Agreement, untying the dollar from gold and causing the collapse of Bretton Woods. America's global blood-sucking hegemony was already solid as a fortress. Just observe the green notes. However, the blueprint for ruling the world with green paper had just been unrolled when the giant red bear bared its claws at the conference table in Yalta. In 1946, British Prime Minister Churchill delivered an anti-communist speech in Fulton. America, like an icy iron curtain crashing heavily down upon the European continent, it drew open the prologue to the Cold War. In 1947, as President Truman delivered his State of the Union address, the US-Soviet Cold War officially entered a suffocating ice age. To combat the expansion of the Soviet Union and communism over the ruins of Europe, America cast out the highly ambitious Marshall Plan in 1947. This was not just a rescue mission for economic recovery, it was a highly successful strategic plot by America. It firmly gripped Western Europe economically and politically in the palm of its hand, establishing a world structure headed by America. Following closely in August 1949, America drew in developed nations from Western Europe and North America, forging the massive international military bloc of NATO. As a tit-for-tat retaliation, the Soviet Union united Eastern European nations to form the Warsaw Pact in 1955. From this point on, the bipolar structure established by the Yalta system strapped the entirety of human civilization onto the powder keg of nuclear annihilation. Let your breath anchor you in the face of this global tension. In this global struggle for dominance lasting half a century, America completely abandoned its former isolationism, conducting extremely fanatic armed expansions on a global scale. They successively, directly or indirectly, plunged into the bloody quagmires of the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Afghan War. Even during the Berlin Crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis, they frantically tested the edge of the nuclear button countless times. The massive, high pressure of the Cold War, like a terrifying crucible, forced America to achieve an astonishing leap in economics, military, and technology. With the drastic changes in Eastern Europe in 1989 and the thunderous collapse of the massive Soviet Empire in 1991, the decades-long Cold War finally came to an end. The bipolar structure and the Yalta system ultimately crumbled into dust. With the fall of its mortal enemy, the Warsaw Pact dissolved, yet NATO, a product of the Cold War, continued to expand like a cancer cell. At this moment, America, looking around the globe, found no more rivals. No other nation possessed the strength to challenge its throne as global hegemon. But you might ask, will the dark currents of history truly stagnate here? Turn the cinematic lens backward, and everything appears to recur in a fateful, recursive loop. Notice the stillness and the rewind. In the very instant that the red flag, bearing the hammer and sickle, fell to the ground, the grainy imagery of the entire world begins to rewind wildly at a dizzying speed. The lens retreats past the burning napalm in the dense jungles of Vietnam, past the suffocating nuclear standoff in the waters off Cuba, past the mushroom clouds rising high above Hiroshima, past the dark silhouettes falling from buildings amidst the stock market crash on Wall Street, past a million withered bones on the muddy battlefields of the Civil War, past the pure white cotton stained with blood in the southern plantations and the cruel yellow dust kicked up by westward wagons, and past the bitter teal eaves poured into Boston Harbor, ultimately freezing its frame on that very deck of the Mayflower, rocking violently in the storm, reeking of mold and the pungent sea. When we slice open the historical texture of these 500 years like a precise surgical operation, we finally see clearly the true underlying color of this empire. It was never built upon the mercy and blessings of God. Every inch of its territory is thoroughly saturated with the blood of indigenous people and the despairing tears of enslaved black bodies. Every single one of its gold vaults is stacked high with the carnival of global resource plunder and the white bones of countless wars. Surrender to this stark reality. This incomparably powerful American empire was forged alive by iron and blood. Amidst the absolute greed of capital, the tragic sacrifice of humanity, and the ruthless calculations of geopolitics, the smoke of the Cold War has dispersed. The empire sits securely upon an iron throne of power constructed of green paper and nuclear weapons, looking out in all directions, invincible across the heavens. Yet the gears of history have never truly stopped. When this world holds no more external enemies capable of striking it down in the deep abyss at the peak of power, the only thing left for it to fear is that massively colossal shadow, covered in deep, structural cracks, silently staring back at itself from within the dark. Now take a deep breath, let the exhausted mind go, and allow the space of awareness to simply be.